Okay, I'm going to call to order the March 11th, 2025 meeting of the Policy and Services Committee. So gentlemen, let's do some good work for the people of Palo Alto. All right, fired up tonight. Okay, let's start with any public comment. Madam Clerk, is there any public comment?
We do not have any requests to speak, and I'll just note for the record that all committee members are present.
Oh, roll call would have been nice. Okay, thank you. See, I'm very fired up. All right, so our first action item, item 1, is nonprofit partnership work plan, phased approach, which was continued from our last meeting in February. So does staff have a presentation? Welcome.
I'll just open it up while she gets settled. This evening, this is a follow-up discussion, and Ms. Lupita Alamos will be leading the staff presentation.
Get started while the presentation's being pulled up. Good evening, Chair and Council members. Lupita Alamos, Assistant to the City Manager, and tonight is a continuation item on our nonprofit partnership work plan. So this is a continuation item. Our recommendation from our previous month of February 11th meeting was to review and recommend a council approval of a phased approach to enhancing nonprofit partnerships, beginning with process improvements for nonprofit requests for funding through fiscal year 26 budget process, which falls out of our currently established process. And just as a review, this work plan establishes, we're in search of establishing a framework that aligns with our nonprofit partnerships with council priorities, ensuring fairness and inclusion, resource allocation, strengthening accountability, and while maintaining the agility to evolving community needs. So that's the overall purpose of the framework. In the first phase, as discussed in our last meeting, is to establish this near-term goal of initiating a process improvement for nonprofit requests that fall outside of the currently established processes. And the second phase, what we plan to do is then tackle some of these other service agreements, lease agreements, and take the foundational learnings from this process into that one. In that second phase, we plan to start that sometime in the summer after we've completed implementation of this first phase. And okay.
Slides get caught up. Okay, can you sync with
Slide 4, please. Thank you. So in summary, the nonprofit work plan that phase 1 that we discussed at our last meeting established this pilot grant program for nonprofit requests, again, currently outside of an established program. We recommended an allocation of $185,000 toward this effort, starting in fiscal year 26 for one-time grant requests. We talked about this funding being available to all 504c3 nonprofits, both new and current recipients. We also discussed scaled application and reporting requirements based on funding requests to keep in mind just the process and the scale, so this doesn't become an administrative burden to our nonprofits. And tonight we'd like to also explore, if desired, staff support to provide an initial application evaluation before coming to policy and services for your review and recommendation. We also, in this report, included a draft application and a rubric, corresponding rubric in this report, if that's something that the committee wants to explore. A couple of things that we didn't discuss last time but are equally important to consider is the use of funds, how we intend these funds to be used. Typically, we focus on programming. However, we'd like to receive feedback on the intended use for these grant requests. And in terms of grant disbursement, it's our city-based practice to disperse these on a reimbursement basis. So we'd like to also get some feedback on that. Next slide. And also for, as requested by the committee, was requests to ask nonprofits on the implementation timeframe. Last month, we presented 2 options. In the first option, we had a 39-day application period, which is a little bit shorter than in the second option, but we had the grant awards being approved along with the budget process. And the second one, we had a longer application period, usually 90-day, very generous. And then the budget would approve the program allocation. However, the grant could be awarded sometime at the end of August to allow that longer application period. Policy and Services requested that staff follow up with nonprofits on their preference. An email was sent out to our nonprofit contacts, as well as held a meeting to also solicit feedback. We had a total of 6 nonprofits that expressed interest for option 1. However, one of those votes was from the Chamber of Nonprofits that represents about 30 nonprofits, and only one person voted for option 2, one organization. Right. And then I also included a slide here for the committee to provide feedback on the draft application, if any thoughts or feedback on that. And this is the intended, an example of the rubric we could use to evaluate those applications once received, paying attention to the weight, kind of reflecting some of the feedback we heard from the discussion last month. So with that, our recommendation again is for the Policy and Services Committee to approve this phase 1 nonprofit work plan, establishing this process to fund requests in the fiscal year 26 budget process for those that are not, that currently fall outside of established grant programs. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for incorporating our feedback from last time. It was evident in the report, and also for soliciting the nonprofit partners' feedback that we asked about. So that's really helpful to see those two things incorporated in this. I think I'll start with any questions from the dais and then go to public comment, and then we can come back and discuss this. So do either of my colleagues have any questions about the staff report? Councilmember Stone.
Thank you. The recommended allocating 185,000 in fiscal year 26, would that be $185,000 total to be then allocated for the request? Can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, that would be 185,000 in total for
Oh.
all requests.
Okay, and that's just that would be recommended in the city manager's budget?
Correct.
I think we wanted to note that this reflects the prior year's allocation and the continuing funding. Ultimately, if the council chooses to allocate more or less, that's certainly within the discretion. But again, as this is coming forward somewhat prior to the actual budget deliberations, we just wanted to use that initial placeholder.
Maybe I can just follow up on, oh, sorry,
Oh, sorry,
I thought you were done.
Made me just think of another question. But this is separate from his wrap and separate from CDBG. Now all heads are nodding. I'm curious, staff has kind of thoughts in sort of the rubric of how we evaluate if there's an agency that is already receiving his wrap or CDBG funds, if there are recommendations on how council would then kind of deal with those type of overlapping organizations. I don't think it's necessary. I think we can do that in our own deliberations, but if there have been consideration around that.
Yeah, and actually that was one of the things we discussed last month, was whether we wanted to have any kind of criteria around nonprofits that already receive funding, and what the feedback that I heard was that we want to balance both access of new organizations to this money while also thinking about those that already receive funding and that may want to use that and leverage that for further funding. So I think it's a balance, and this being a pilot, we can kind of see what comes in and learn from that.
Yeah, and I think that should sort of be the I think that should sort of be the spirit in which we approach it this year, is that this is a pilot and it's not going to be perfect and we should be trying out different things. So I'm excited to see how this goes. Okay, now I'm done, Chair.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on the first question because I was a little confused about, so I see the recommendation in the slide of allocating 185,000 in FY26. In the staff report, under the fiscal/resource impact, it talks about the FY 2025 budget provided $246,000 in funding for citywide events that I presume are recited there because you think they might be covered by this bucket. And so I'm wondering, and then it says ongoing, 235,000 would be budgeted. So we have 246 in 2025, a recommendation of 185 in FY 26, and then ongoing 200. I'm confused. Can you reconcile those three numbers for me?
Right, I do apologize. What I should have included in the fiscal impact that we included in the last report was that the 185,000 was largely made up of these one-time requests last year. And that 50,000 of the 245 or 55,000 would be used for community events.
So if we look at the 235 ongoing, 50 of that's for community events. And so in the slide, you're talking about the remainder, 185 for the nonprofit partners.
That's correct.
Okay, that adds up. Now, it's still slightly lower than 2025. And I'm just thinking, as we go forward, it's rare that things go down. So is that just budgeting conservatism given our fiscal situation?
That's certainly a factor, but like Mr. Shikata said, certainly this is a pilot, and if the committee wants to recommend something different, we can certainly put that into consideration.
Yeah, and on a related note, at the end of the fiscal impact paragraph, talks about how no additional resources were added in FY 2025, but if the program expands, might be an additional staff resource of 125,000 annually. I assume that if it expands to the point that we need that much of a staff resource, we're also likely to have a larger budget to administer. Is that a fair assumption?
Yes, though I don't see our CSD director here, but yes, that would be the assumption, is that it would scale with the grant amount and the administrative processing required.
Yeah, because I would think to go make that big of an investment in a staff member without, parallel increase in what they're administering wouldn't make a lot of sense. So, okay. I had a couple other questions I want to see. I sort of jumped in there because it was follow on to Councilmember Stone. So, Councilmember Lee, do you have any questions or no? Not for now. Okay.
Yeah.
Then I did have, I think, one other. I did just want to note that, just for clarity in the record, that I appreciated very much the scaling of the reporting requirements. And I noticed when we actually got to the form, they're kind of under development, but you scaled that, which I think is really appropriate for the size of the grants. I did just notice in the packet, it talks about grants greater than 5,000 in the first bullet. And I think that's supposed to be a less than 5,000 sign. So just, and yeah, so, and those bullets, if it falls between 5,000 and 6,000, I think you just want to jigger that a little bit more precisely. I had another question that got answered when I actually read your form, so I don't have to ask it. That'll save as a comment. I think I'll save my other comments for later. So let's move to public comment.
There are no requests to speak on this item.
I think maybe we have one. Honorable Mr. Moody, welcome to our chambers. Welcome back to our chambers.
Thank you, Vice Mayor Menaker. Council members Stone and Liu. My name is Larry Moody. I serve as the Government Affairs Community Liaison for Job Train, which is a nonprofit workforce organization that has been in existence here on the peninsula for the last 42 years. We've been a part of the OIC of America for 60 years. And actually on April 30th, shameless plug, we're going to have our annual Breakfast of Champions, in which the Palo Alto community will be invited to as well. I'm here to speak about our eligibility for this Palo Alto grant. We are a nonprofit organization. Our Salesforce data over the last 4 years has demonstrated that we've provided over 558 Palo Alto residents, not East Palo Alto. I know we sometimes share that zip code, with services, and services have totaled over 2,000 services. And those services can be anything from an initial intake, resume help, preparation, interviewing skills and techniques, helping them with their job search, LinkedIn profiles, and things of that nature. And that's in our career centers. We also provide training for certified nursing associates, medical assistants, building and trade, building maintenance. We also are actively involved in childcare development at our center as well, a wide range of services that are free to all the clients that come through our door. And what we would like to know is, since we are serving historically such a large portion of Palo Alto residents, do we have to be a brick and mortar organization, right, within the boundaries of Palo Alto to receive funding for this grant application program through community services? We also would like to inform you that we are building a 110,000 square foot facility scheduled for groundbreaking in about 6 months in East Palo Alto, right? So we're expanding our footprint, which would create more opportunities for Palo Alto residents to participate in our program. So I think for tonight, our qualifying question as an organization, can we apply for your grant applications through community services? We feel we meet all the criteria that are solicited on the grant application that you posted publicly. And if we can move forward, we look forward to being a nonprofit partner who is supported by the community and by the City Council of Palo Alto. Okay.
Thank you for your public comment. Do we have any other speakers?
We do not have other speakers.
All right, so we'll close public comment on this item. Let's bring it back to the dais. Comments? Councilmember Liu.
Thank you. And just to address the public commenter's question, there are no restrictions for groups that are not headquartered in Palo Alto physically to apply for these grants, right?
That's correct. We only have the requirement that it be a 501c3 nonprofit organization.
And just to add to that, as presented, one of the recommendations would be that, to your point, it's not a requirement to be in Palo Alto, but one of the evaluation criteria would be service to Palo Alto residents.
Right. So neither the event nor the organization technically has to be physically in Palo Alto. Like maybe the event is even virtual, but if it's implausibly outside of the city, it's just going to get very low marks in the rubric. So we don't need any additional actual policies there, seemingly. I think the rubric makes sense as is, and I think the weights are also generally appropriate. I think presumably we'd actually make a more detailed rubric when we actually evaluate the applications. I think equity impact is an important one to really be clear on. You could argue, for example, that seniors are, or at least the seniors who currently live in Palo Alto, are not particularly underserved or underrepresented, for example. Or you could make other kind of arguments that are tricky to interpret and parse. The only other comment that I had was on the event form. I think it's worth also checking if the event is expected to be free for the community. That's not necessarily a given, since I know some events like the Magical Bridge Friendsgiving, which was great, had a $20 ticket price, which of course is not meant to recoup costs, but just to kind of manage demand. But nonetheless, I think just having an estimated price is also a useful thing to ask. Thank you.
Councilmember Stone, do you have any comments?
No, I support the proposal, and based on the feedback from the nonprofits, I'll support, what was it, option one, and I agree. I think the weighting makes sense. And again, I think we should all keep an open mind over the year as we see this pilot unfold, and then next year we can re-examine and determine if the weighting needs to be changed at all, or if we need to add anything.
Thank you. First of all, I appreciate the staff assist with the rubric, because I think one of the questions to us was, do we want you all to screen it or not? And my answer is yes, and I think implicitly theirs is as well, because they like the rubric. And I think just helping us sort of quantify and categorize what's coming in with the rubric is helpful. The only thing I would caution a bit about in the rubric is item 4, program sustainability. Because sometimes if it's a one-off event, it's not as big a deal if they can't repeat it year after year. If it's useful and a good investment and a good ROI, for it, you might still want to do it. And again, or if it's a very small or new organization and it's unclear, but again, the event dollars, bang for the buck type thing works out. So 20% is fairly low, so I don't have a problem there and we can see behind the numbers, but I just wanted to point out that that may not be as hard and fast a metric as some of the others. Yeah, and again, following up on the public comment, there is a section in the proposed forms. There's a draft form right now that we're looking at tonight. It's the first time we've seen it, and it's very thoughtful and really does reflect what we talked about. And so under the program and community impact, it's total number of people estimated to be served, and then how many of those are Palo Alto residents, and how many Palo Alto residents are generally served by the agency. So I think with all of that, we can get a sense of how impactful it would be within our city, regardless of the situs of the actual entity. And then under the equity impact section, I like the question about the outreach of the organization, like how does it try to reach underserved populations? But it also made me think that I would be interested as part of assessing the likely success of the event to also ask about outreach, perhaps not just in the context of equity impact. So I don't know if there's a way to do that both places without making it too redundant. So in other words, like the program and community impact, I would be interested to know how they reach out to Palo Altans generally. And let's see. Oh, and just going back to the reporting requirements, as I mentioned before, thank you for working out some sort of staged reporting. But I have to confess a little ignorance here. As we get to the larger requests, the 25,000 and above and the 100,000 and above, talks about asking for independently prepared compilation report or CPA reviewed financial statements. What's a compilation report?
A compilation report is essentially, it is reviewed by a certified accountant. So it's not as engaged and as involved and as a, let's say, audited financial, where they're taking all of that information and applying, their template and processing. It's a more simpler way to report out. And again, because it's only reviewed by a certified accountant, I think there is less of a cost associated with that level of reporting.
Okay, so when it says independently prepared compilation report or CPA review, are those synonyms for each other? They're not two different things?
That's correct.
Okay, that's what I misunderstood. Okay, got it. So that is the CPA reviewed financial statement.
Mhm.
Understood. Okay, well, I'm eager to see how this goes this year as well. I think this captures well what we discussed. And I
Chair,
think the only other,
I do apologize for interrupting. One thing before we do end that I would love to hear feedback is on
The
the
timing.
use of funds. Whether that should be for programming only, or whether this council sees that also used as overhead or staffing. Some feedback would be helpful.
okay. Colleagues, feedback on that? I'll stall for a minute while you think. Because I think we also haven't really touched on the option 1, option 2 timing that what you also asked us about. And I think you had all but one nonprofit partner said the shorter timeline they preferred. I'm good with that. And so maybe when my colleagues answer on the other question, they could comment on that as well. Either of you have thoughts?
I weighed in earlier on option 1. I support option 1, and I don't have a problem being a little more, I guess, less restrictive over how the funds are being used. I mean, I don't like taking kind of a paternalistic approach to telling nonprofits who are the ones who really know how best to use their money, telling them how they can and cannot use it. I always had frustrations, I know, like around CDBG funds that are federally controlled. We're very restricted on how those can be used. I always found that to be really frustrating. I think a lot of the nonprofits find that to be frustrating. So I think here, if they're using the funds to be able to keep the lights on, but that then means that other funds are being able to be used towards services that are helping Palo Alto residents and the underserved, what should it matter to us where our funds exactly are going if ultimately they're able to do the work that they're trying to do. So I think we should leave it up to the experts and the nonprofits to make that decision.
I actually have a slightly different perspective. I think day-to-day operations should, if we're funding day-to-day operations through a one-time grant, then the nonprofit may not be very stable or be able to potentially fulfill its mission otherwise. I think I think the main focus will be on programming, and that's presumably what most of the applications we get will be anyways. Potentially there's something like an NIH style model where you say 20% of your grant amount could be used on overhead for the salaries of the person who's going to spend time putting on the event, for example. Which otherwise kind of maybe balances some of Councilmember Stone's concerns. So yeah, I would prefer programming or some ratio that keeps it more oriented towards programming.
So my thought on this is a little bit in between, but generally toward what Councilmember Stone said, and perhaps what Councilmember Liu said at the end. I don't want to prohibit that because, at least as a portion of it, I think that grant applications that have higher percentages of overhead or infrastructure may perhaps be less competitive. But if they need some of that to get it done, I just don't think at this point we have enough data to be restrictive about it. And these aren't huge amounts of money either. So if they need a portion of it for something that might be categorized as overhead or infrastructure, I'm fine with that. I'm not yet prepared to do that. I think that's something we can revisit when we get a year or two under our belts, and perhaps if the program grows larger. But I would, I think most applicants know that nobody wants to fund infrastructure, right? Nobody wants to fund administrative costs. So if they want to, they can use their own judgment about how to make their grant application attractive, and then we'll use our judgment about whether or not it is on a case-by-case basis. Councilmember Stone.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it should be part of the policy, but at the end of the day, right, it's the council that will approve these grant requests.
Oh, apologies. Yes, that is correct.
Yes, but so I think I agree. I think we all want to see programming, but I don't think we want to be overly restrictive. I sat in a lot when I was on the HRC, sat on, I think every single time I was on CDBG and his rep dealing with these nonprofit requests, and especially when it came to CDBG, how restrictive. So many times there were programs things that we wanted to fund, but because just a little bit may have gone towards some of the overhead or other things, we were not able to. So I think we would regret it if we included that in the policy. But agreed, when we're making the decision, I think we are going to be doing exactly what the chair described, looking more for those programming.
So are there any other issues, staff, that you would like for us to opine on?
No, thank you. I think that addresses a lot of the feedback we wanted to receive from the committee tonight. Thank you.
Okay, so do you need a motion on this one? All right, do I have a motion relative to the staff recommendation?
Yeah, I'll move the staff recommendation. And do we need to incorporate anything that we discussed then, or?
We could have this motion to approve the Phase 1 nonprofit work plan or nonprofit work plan Phase 1 with the committee's recommendations, and I've taken notes here to reflect those.
Okay, so we don't need to recite option 1 and all of that.
No,
Okay.
I have that.
I'll second since I have the mic open.
The one item you may wish to discuss prior to your vote is if it is a unanimous vote, then per the council's protocol, this would go on consent for the full council review. But depending on your interest, you may want to have a council discussion, in which case we could reflect that as well. So your choice. Not to assume
I
a
don't think
unanimous
there's a
vote,
need
but
for a whole council discussion.
Yeah, I'll incorporate into the motion that if it's unanimous, goes on consent.
And I have no objection to that. I think that we didn't do anything wild and radical here, so if they want to pull it, they can. All right, so I think with that, Madam Clerk, would you call the roll?
Councilmember Lou,
Yes.
Councilmember Stone,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Binker,
Yes,
motion carries.
excellent, thank you. All right, so let's move on to our second action item, which is presentation of the Office of the City Auditor quarterly report for the period of October to December of 2024. So welcome, Ms. Murdoch.
Good evening, committee members. Kate Murdoch, City Auditor. I'm pleased to present our status report for the second quarter of FY25. Next slide, please. For tonight's agenda, we'll be looking at audit activities, the status of audit projects, various other reporting and benchmarking. We can go to the next slide, please. We had a busy second quarter this year with the results of the fiscal year 24 risk assessment and resulting FY25 audit plan being presented to the Policy and Services Committee and adopted by City Council in December. The audited financial statements were presented to the Finance Committee in December with no exceptions noted. 2 audits were also presented to the Policy and Services Committee, the ADA compliance audit and the recruitment and succession planning audit. We closed 1 hotline investigation during this quarter and 1 investigation is still in process. No additional hotline allegations were received. We presented the first quarter status report on audit activities and finally began work on the audit services benchmarking assessment that is specified in the Baker Tilly contract. Next slide, please. This slide shows the status of all audits from the FY24 audit plan. As mentioned, 2 audits were presented to Policy and Services and another 2 were presented in February. 3 other audit projects are all in reporting and will be reported out this spring. Next slide, please. This slide shows the status of audits from the FY25 audit plan, which commenced in January. All audits were kicked off in January and several of these are now moving into the field phase. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, we had 0 new allegations this quarter. 1 allegation is still in process, but will be closed out soon. And 1 allegation was closed with no issues found. Next slide, please. This is the first year that Baker Tilly has conducted a benchmarking survey of audit services, and we completed a comparative analysis of several Bay Area and California cities. Also, as we were working on the analysis, the Association of Local Government Auditors, also known as ALGA, published their 2024 benchmarking survey, which is a survey of all member agencies. While some of the metrics and information provided in ALGA's survey are less applicable to our benchmarking efforts, for example, they look at personnel service costs, compensation by audit position, and the generational makeup of chief audit executives, among other things. However, I did want to highlight a few of their metrics and how I estimate that Baker Tilly compares. Next slide, please. Prior to outsourcing its audit function, the City of Palo Alto was a member agency of ALGA, and I want to note that Baker Tilly is also a member. I was able to see on ALGA's website that there are roughly 50 local government agencies in California that are members of ALGA, including such entities as transportation authorities and county controllers. Of that list, we chose the following cities to benchmark against: In terms of benchmarking criteria, we looked at population size, audit budget, number of FTEs, and number of reports issued. Based on this data, we calculated a very simple cost per audit based on the budget and number of reports issued. I do want to note that there are several challenges when making such comparisons, as audits can range widely in type and scope. In addition, performance audits often span across fiscal years, making it difficult to arrive at a cost per audit unless the agency is specifically tracking that information. We did not find publicly available audit cost information. Next slide, please. As you can see, there is a wide range of per audit costs when calculated in this way. I want to note that Berkeley noted various staffing and other issues related to them having only one audit report issued in FY 2024. FY 2024 was also an interesting year for Palo Alto and Baker Tilly with the transition in audit management. As you can see, in FY 24, Baker Tilly issued 3 audit reports with an average cost per audit of $122,000. Please note that this audit budget includes various reporting and the hotline in order to make it comparable to the other cities. So the price per audit is actually lower. For comparison, I've also included our data for 2025 so far. These numbers reflect the budget and audit outputs only through February of this year. As you can see, the cost per audit has come down this year. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, many of the comparative metrics provided in the ALGA benchmarking survey are less applicable given the nature of our contract with the city. However, I did want to highlight some metrics and how Baker Tilly compares. Palo Alto was in the small audit shop category in the past, which is defined as 3 to 5 full-time auditors. I estimate that roughly 14 Baker Tilly staff have worked on Palo Alto audits in the past year. This includes our use of subject matter experts from other areas and branches of the firm. For example, we had SMEs from our consulting group advise on our approach to the dispatch center assessment and the grant management and recruitment and succession planning audit. According to ALGA's survey, on average, 57% of staff hours are allocated directly to audits for small shops, with other staff time spent in training, vacation, and other administrative activities. In contrast, over 70% of Baker Tilly's contract hours in 2024 were allocated directly to audit, with the other hours spent on various reporting, oversight of the city's external financial audit process, and the city's hotline. As such, our percentage of contract hours going to audit activities is much higher than 70%, but I wanted to be conservative with these numbers. ALGA's survey reported that 95% of management agreed with audit recommendations. For the audits reported in FY24 for Palo Alto, 100% of management agreed with our recommendations. Finally, ALGA survey participants reported on estimated financial impacts related to audit findings and recommendations. I think that this is a difficult metric to determine, which is why it's explicitly stated as an estimate. This is not a metric that we have been tracking, but it is something I plan to look into to see how other audit shops are tracking this measurement and how accurate it is. Next slide, please. I wanted to share this graphic from the ALGA survey of small audit shop data related to audit plans as compared to ranked audit risk areas. So basically, this graph is showing the percent of audits conducted by type against the identified risk areas. So as you can see on the left-hand side, most small audit shops are spending most of their audit time conducting audits related to internal controls, followed by grant or compliance audits, and third on the list is fraud, waste, and abuse. In contrast, the highest risk areas identified by most small audit shops are related to IT controls and cybersecurity, which are at the bottom of the audit plan list. I think this reflects the difficulty that smaller shops have in generally not being able to have subject matter experts in areas like IT auditing. They really need to have generalists. I think one of the benefits that Palo Alto has realized from its partnership with Baker Tilly is that we have been able to conduct several IT control and cybersecurity audits using our specialized IT audit group. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Ms. Murdoch. Do we have questions up here? Councilmember Stone.
Thank you. Thanks, Ms. Murdoch. I just have one question. It was under task 5, the hotline monitoring and other administrative functions. curious if you looked into city's code enforcement and effectiveness of our Palo Alto 311.
Is not part of the hotline function, but those are certainly audit risk areas that are considered when we're developing the audit plan.
Okay, yeah, I think looking forward, that would be a valuable area to look into. I think that's one of the areas, talking to residents over the years, is just constantly a complaint and frustration that complaints will go to Palo Alto 311 and they will go unanswered, or there'll be several complaints over a long period of time, and the city and code enforcement can be very slow responding. I know in the past, code enforcement was really understaffed, but we have beefed that up, and I'd like to see if we're becoming more effective or timely in responding to those. So maybe then for a future audit. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I have one just simple question. I think I know the answer to, but under task 3, where it talks about selection of external financial auditor, so it mentions Macias, Ginny, and O'Connell, MGO. So is that like the one area where Baker Tilly doesn't do the audit, or how does that work? What's the relationship there?
Correct. So we help provide oversight of that audit service, and we've in the past helped negotiate the MGO contract. And we then review their reports and sit in on any status updates that they have to discuss issues. So, but that is not, you typically would not have a city auditor providing the financial statement audit as well.
Okay, so I see. So Baker Tilly kind of performs the function of that's often performed by internal auditors. And since this is typically by external, you then liaise with this other audit firm to do the financial.
Correct.
Okay, all right, that explains that. And I had a question on the benchmarking analysis. So, and I'm sure it's very hard to find comparable cities and to sort this all out. But when you first mentioned the other government agencies that were considered in the criteria and FTEs were mentioned, I thought it was ours. And then when I saw the chart on the next page, I saw it was yours. And at least people performing the audit function for us from Baker Tilly. But that begs the question of sort of how does the size of our city and our city staff factor in? And so the chart on slide, I think it's 9, that's the benchmarking analysis, comparative information. If we look at the populations of the other cities, they're all larger than ours. Berkeley is the closest, but it looks like something aberrant is happening there because they had the one audit with the $3 billion cost. So if we set them aside, the next smallest city is 3 times ours. And so what I'm wondering is when you do audit functions, what impact, if any, does that have? And then, and this may relate, so I'll ask it now and let you answer both. I think this also includes audits of our utilities department, which may or may not be the case for other cities when they have, say, PG&E or some private utilities serving the city. So if you could comment on those 2 things about comparators, that would be helpful.
So certainly, I do appreciate that. We weren't able to really identify anybody who had the same type of city audit. City auditor function that was close to Palo Alto, that was in the area. That's something that we can certainly look at in the future to see if there's, this is our first time doing the benchmarking survey. So very open to looking at other cities if we think there are cities that are more comparable. And I want to make sure that I'm addressing your questions. So is it asking about the complexity of audits versus the number of staff, or?
Well, so I don't know, because I don't know a lot about how these audits are, but what I'm wondering is if you're a larger city, presumably you have larger staff, if you have more staff and more things to look through in terms of, whether procedures are followed, whether safeguards are in place, I assume that increases the complexity and thus the cost of the audit, but I don't know that. So if that were the case, it would make this benchmarking harder to say that these were analogous. So I'm just trying to ask you to reflect on whether or not the size of the city and thus the size of the staff affects the relevance of the comparator.
Sure. I think it's so dependent on how the audit has been. And I think one of the things I found most challenging about doing this exercise is it's very hard to tell the type of audits that are being issued. I mean, you can dig into that data, and I think I made some notes on the slide showing that, for a couple of these cities that had larger outputs, it was, the audits were not nearly as complex. I think you are going to need to look at similar elements no matter the size of the city, right? Depending on the function that you're looking at. But a lot of it is about scoping. And so I don't know if that kind of gets at your question, but.
Partly, and I am going to answer my own question a little bit here. I know you do a utility billing audit, so it definitely gets into the utility function, which kind of makes us sort of a bigger city or a bigger thing to audit because other cities that might not have that. But I know that's like, half of our employees. So we're kind of an unusual comparator. So is it just the one audit for utilities? I'm looking here
in this period, yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I do appreciate you initiating that this year because I think it's, helpful for us to know so we're not operating in a vacuum. And I appreciate that it's not an easy task to undertake. Let's see if I have any other questions before second. Okay. So that's all I have for the moment. Shall I go to public comment or would you like to ask a question beforehand? There may not be any. Okay. All right, Madam Clerk, do we have any public comment?
We do not have any public comments.
We do not. So do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to working on the audit priorities. I suppose that's really all, maybe starting now in a preliminary way, but really going to ramp up next quarter. I think for future quarters, I'd really want to see an alternative set of cities for the benchmarking analysis. Population, of course, is very different in these cities. Berkeley is nearly 2 times larger than Palo Alto. I think for likely the majority of these cities, the city auditor is also an elected position, which has a very different scope, FTE requirements, kind of audits that they conduct and so on. I think that at least could be a column, or better yet, we could exclude some of the cities that have elected auditors, since that's a huge qualitative difference. I'd also like to see at least a couple of other cities where the audit function is outsourced as well, so we can get a more apples to apples comparison about how Baker Tilly is serving the city compared to how Baker Tilly is maybe serving other cities, or maybe how other firms are serving other cities. I think getting at least a couple of examples where the audit function is outsourced will be useful. So yeah, I think that is something that I would really, really want to see for future quarters. Otherwise, the only small kind of clarifying point I had was, so we have 14 plus FTEs who worked on the city of Palo Alto's audits in some way over the last quarter, or sorry, over the last year. Can you give some context on how people are assigned on different projects and kind of where that 14 plus number comes from? it's great that we have a lot of people who work on this, but I also want, ideally the same people keep working on Palo Alto issues. We have more expertise and continuity. So that's where I'm coming from.
Sure, yeah, and I that is really an excellent point, and as I'm looking at now, I'm realizing it's probably somewhat misleading in that I would not say that there are 14 FTEs. We have audit staff who work on audit projects for other cities, and so we don't have anybody who's just specifically dedicated and only dedicated to Palo Alto. That being said, for the FY25 audit plan, I've had, I would say, 2 individuals who've been dedicated and on every single project. They were also on projects in the FY24 audit plan. So we are trying to kind of build that knowledge base and that familiarity with the city and its processes from that perspective. In terms of other assignments, we really try and fit, who's done an audit on purchasing cards before, for another California city. Do we have that person? What did it look like? What were their findings? So we bring that person on board. In terms of subject matter experts, and I think that's one of the real gains that you get with outsourcing with a company like ours, is we have people who are industry experts in cybersecurity, for example, who work in the private sector and maybe sometimes work in the public sector, but they're able to bring all of that knowledge to the table, and really give us a sense of what are the risks that we need to be aware of. In terms of the IT controls and cybersecurity audits, we've actually had those IT specific audit staff working on those audits. So we haven't had our auditors that I would say are more generalists working on those. So we really try and staff each audit with people who have experience, while balancing that with, people wanting to grow their skills and learn about new topics. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that helps. Good to know that we have a core crew, and then we also work with subject matter experts depending on the audit. Thank you.
Hey, anything else? So I don't have anything else either. So we need a motion to recommend that council accept the audit report, quarterly report. So do I have such a motion?
So moved.
I'll second.
Thank you. Okay, let's go. Let's have a vote.
Vice Mayor Vinker,
Yes.
Councilmember Lou,
Yes.
Councilmember Stone,
Yes.
motion carries.
Thank you. And so lastly, I'll just mention that about future meetings and agendas. Our next meeting is on April 8th, I believe, and getting a thumbs up. And I just wanted to mention, we will have at least one, if not 2 audits on that agenda. And tonight's agenda was pretty light, but they're going to get pretty heavy pretty fast. I want to thank Deputy City Manager Chantal Cotton Gaines for working on that and keeping up with the referrals that are coming in, and things are moving around. But we went through the year today, and there's a lot, I think, of important policy matters that we're going to get to discuss and consider in future months. So enjoy the early night tonight, because we may be a little later in the future. So thank you all. And we have a note. Please go ahead.
I think Ms. Pryor and I are probably asking the same question, one of which is next month. Do you also want to have the 6 p.m. start time again?
Good question. I think I'll get a revolt from these guys if I say anything but yes.
Excellent. We will plan for that. And also just to remind the committee, when the council reviews the rest of your priority objectives, so there's another half of that, we also have a draft work plan that we've shared for both Finance Committee and Policy and Services. So to Chair Vinker's point, there'll be an opportunity for the full council to somewhat see what's on the docket this year, and the items will come to you. The dates may change depending on availability of staff, et cetera. But just wanted to let you know there, as Chair Vinker said, there's a lot to come.
A lot to come.
And I'm so sorry, very
Yes.
briefly. Thank you very much, Ms. Cotton Gaines. That was my question. But rather than trying to schedule meeting by meeting, would the committee like to choose 6 p.m. as their normal start time?
I think that's the sense of the committee.
Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you all. We are adjourned.